I slowly slid my hand under her shirt, clearly feeling every centimetre of her smooth and warm skin. Her body trembled under each gentle touch. Her breathing became more rapid as my hands moved higher, stopping at her slim waist. She tilted her head slightly forward, her lips finding mine. This kiss was no longer a groping, but a blend of intense emotions, of unstoppable desire. She pulled me down onto the bed, her body heating up little by little as each layer of clothing on her body was removed. Her smooth white skin was like light shining under the lamp. I couldn't take my eyes off her body. Every movement, every breath of hers seemed to be engraved in my memory, making each moment more vivid. Hello everyone, welcome to our channel, where we will bring you the most interesting and dramatic stories in life. It will take the audience from one surprise to another. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any episodes. If you love Jane, go to the playlist to find Jane's other channels. In today's video, we will bring you the story of Mary. Please follow along. I grew up in a small village on the riverbank, where life passed peacefully between the rainy and sunny seasons. My father, Mr. Bin, passed away when I was very young, leaving my mother and me in an old thatched house. My father sacrificed himself in a battle offshore, fighting to protect the homeland sea. Stories about my father were told by villagers on occasion, about his bravery and courage in the last hours before the fateful bullet took his life. Every time I heard them, I felt proud, but also burdened. My eldest brother, James, left the village a long time ago to find a living at sea. He did not follow his father's career, but chose the job of transporting goods on large ships, transporting goods from one Kevin port to another. Since the day he married Mary, a girl from a neighbouring village, he seemed to disappear, leaving only Mary behind with my mother to manage the house and take care of the ripe rice fields. My mother, Mrs. Zara, still maintains the same gentle and hard-working style as before. Her life is attached to the fields, the afternoons sitting by the pond, her eyes looking towards the distant horizon as if searching for the figure of her husband, who has never returned. Every time the sunset falls, her eyes are filled with silent sadness, and the pain of loneliness seems to be deeply engraved in her every gesture. I do not know how to comfort her. I can only stand silently beside her and watch quietly. Mary appeared in my life like a cool breeze. She was James's wife, and since he left, she became the only woman in the house, besides my mother. She was very different, not too outstanding, but had a strange attraction. With a slim figure, white skin, and dove eyes, she made anyone Kevin stop to look when she passed by. When she smiled, her whole face was radiant. But recently, her smile seemed to not appear as often anymore. Mary often stood alone on the dike, looking out to the river. The villagers began to gossip about why James no longer returned home to visit. People said that he had found happiness with another woman, and that Mary could not have children, which was what made him leave her. The taunts rang out day and night, but she never spoke up to refute. Only late at night, when everything was quiet, could I hear her lament, the sound of sobbing echoing through the brick walls of the simple house. Every time I saw her sad, my heart sank. She was too young to endure such great loneliness. Kevin should have enjoyed a happy life with her husband and children, but now she felt lost, immersed in emotions that no one could understand. One summer night, when the moonlight shone across the fields, I took the opportunity to go out to the ditch to look for frogs. That night, there weren't as many frogs as usual, so I decided to return home early. Sweaty and muddy, I intended to go to the ditch to cool off, but when I got close to the ditch, I suddenly heard the sound of water splashing, strongly as if someone was bathing. I stopped, feeling curious. At this time, my mother was asleep, and Mary normally didn't have the habit of bathing late at night. I quietly approached the banana grove, trying not to make any noise. Standing behind the leaves, I carefully observed. The moonlight shone down, and before my eyes appeared an image that I could not forget. Mary's white bare back was pouring buckets of water over herself. That scene seemed to draw me into another world. Her silhouette under the moonlight was vague, comfortably and gently revealing her neck and shoulders. Her skin was light and flawless. I clung tightly to the banana tree, eyes wide open, heart pounding. For the first time in my life, I felt such a strong attraction to Mary. Streams of water rolled down her body, the moonlight reflecting off her curves. I couldn't take my eyes off her, couldn't control myself. All I wanted at that moment was to watch her, absorbed in the image of her bathing in the moonlight. This feeling was both strange and strong, making me unable to forget it. That night I went back to bed but couldn't sleep. The image of Mary kept lingering in my mind. Every little detail was clear. I wondered if this was normal. Was I breaking some forbidden peak heaven? After that night, every time I saw Mary, I felt a strange confusion. Every time she smiled at me, I felt my heart beat faster and her eyes became deeper. I didn't know if she noticed the change in me or not, but the indescribable feelings grew in my heart like a smouldering fire. There were afternoons when we went to the fields together. I couldn't help but watch her as she walked through the rice fields, her every move becoming more and more seductive in my eyes. I began to notice every little detail about her. From the way she tied her hair up to the sweat stains on her neck when she worked in the sun, things I had never noticed before now made me unable to stop thinking. At night I tossed and turned, unable to sleep, my mind haunted by her image, the image of the evening under the moonlight. Maybe I was too young to understand what I was going through, but I knew one thing for sure. I was attracted to Mary in a way I had never thought possible before. As time passed, the relationship between Mary and I gradually became closer. She no longer avoided me. Every time we worked together, she often laughed and talked happily, and sometimes I felt something different in her eyes when she looked at me. One evening after dinner, she asked me to help her wash her hair. I tried to stay calm as I poured cool water over her long black hair. The scent of soapberry made me feel intoxicated, and the image of her silky black hair wet under my hand made me even more agitated. She lowered her head to reveal her white neck, and I could no longer control myself. The emotions I had suppressed for so long exploded inside me. I secretly thought that maybe she felt something too. I stood close to her, feeling the warmth radiating from her body, my heart beating fast, each breath becoming heavy. I could not take my eyes off her. The scent of soapberry from her hair wafted through the air, and I could not help but take a deep breath. Mary, the sister-in-law I had always respected, now appeared in my eyes not only as a relative, but also as a fascinating woman. I tried to control the racing thoughts in my head, but the feeling of closeness, of Mary's pull, grew stronger. When she raised her head to look straight into my eyes, her deep eyes held something I couldn't decipher. Perhaps it was a deep sadness, perhaps an unspoken emptiness. She said nothing, but her eyes seemed to draw me closer, and I knew that something had changed between us that could not be denied. After that evening, Mary and I became closer. She no longer kept her distance from me, but became closer, more intimate than ever. There were afternoons, when the pale yellow sunlight gradually fell on the fields. We sat together under the old bamboo roots, drinking cool sips of water from the water gourd hanging on the tree branches. Both of us silently looked at the golden rice fields stretching out before our eyes. The gentle wind blew, making the rice stalks sway, creating rustling sounds like wordless stories. At this time, I felt even closer to Mary, like a dear companion. Then one night, when the whole family was asleep, I heard the sound of water splashing from behind the house. I don't know why, but my feet kept following the sound of the water. I couldn't help but go back to the place where I first saw her under the moonlight. And then once again, I saw her bathing under the dreamy moonlight. My heart was beating fast, my hands and feet were shaking, but I couldn't shake off the state of shock. Her white back appeared before my eyes again, radiating a shimmering halo under the moonlight like a fairy in the mortal world. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but the feeling of longing rose again. I had never longed for her so much, never had this feeling been so clear and strong. Another night, after working in the fields all day, I came home tired, sweaty and dirty, and decided to take a bath before going to bed. As I stepped out of the well, I heard Mary's footsteps behind me. She called out to me in her usual gentle voice, "Kevin, are you done bathing?" I turned to look. Her eyes were gentle, but there was something different. She reached out to the water, took the ladle, and made a request. "Can you help me pour water to wash my hair like the other day?" My heart was pounding. Memories of the first time I poured water for her came flooding back, and I knew I couldn't refuse. I nodded, trying to keep my composure but feeling elated inside. She sat down, letting her long black hair fall, and I carefully poured water over her hair, ladle by ladle. Her hair was soft and silky, the scent of the water running through each strand, and the feeling of the water falling on her skin made me unable to control myself any longer. I leaned closer, looking at the white space at her neck, where each drop of water was rolling down, the burning desire in my heart, unable to stop. She didn't say anything. She sat there silently. I felt her breathing. My heartbeat became heavier. My hands trembled when touching her hair. Then she suddenly turned back, her eyes looking straight at me. That look made me unable to escape. "Kevin, please give me a little more." She spoke softly, but the sound echoed in my head. Her hand grasped mine, then slowly moved down to press against her cheek. I no longer thought about anything, only knowing that I was caught up in a whirlwind of emotions that I could not control. In these moments, all boundaries were erased. Mary and I were like being caught up in another world, where there were only the two of us. The emotions that had been suppressed for so long burst out. Mary, the woman I had always respected, had now become the object of my desire, and I could not stop. Her every gesture, her every look, seemed to add fuel to the fire burning inside me. The intimacy between us became more and more obvious, and as I leaned closer to her, I knew there was no turning back. I had completely lost control. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and desire. Her hands lightly touched my shoulders, and I knew that she felt the same. We were caught up in a whirlwind of intense emotions, beyond reason or logic. I stood close behind her, feeling my breathing quicken by the second. My hand gently held hers as I lifted the ladle. The feeling of her soft skin under my fingers made me unable to contain the longing in my heart. She sighed as if she was feeling something that could not be described in words. I could hear her breathing, and I knew she could not stop. We were too close, too familiar with each other. I softly whispered, "Sister Mary." She did not answer, but I could feel the response in her body. My hand gently wrapped around her slender waist, pulling her closer. I felt the warmth from her body flow into me, and I could no longer control it. The tense emotions that had been suppressed for so long were now released like an unquenchable fire. She turned to look at me, her deep black eyes flashing with hesitation, but there was also a desire within that she could not hide. Without waiting any longer, I leaned down and kissed her lips. The kiss was gentle at first, but then became more intense as she responded to me. Her lips were soft, and her whole body trembled under the heat of the strong attraction. She let herself fall into my kiss. Her arms wrapped around my back as if to hold me closer. In the quiet night, only our heavy breathing echoed. I pulled her closer, my hands tracing the curves of her body, feeling every detail of her skin under my fingers. Mary seemed to melt into me, no longer resisting, letting her desire guide her. "Come inside," she ordered softly. Her voice was a soft whisper. I didn't need Kevin to wait for another word. Together we entered the small room where everything would no longer be a secret. I closed the door, and in the dim light of the oil lamp, we no longer kept what was reserved for ourselves. In the dim light of the room, the space seemed to become quiet. Only Mary's light breathing echoed in the atmosphere thick with intimacy. I stood right next to her, my hand still hovering over her shoulder, clearly feeling every soft and warm line under my palm. My eyes stopped on her face, where her smooth white skin stood out against the warm yellow light. She sat on the edge of the bed, her white shirt unbuttoned, revealing her slender collarbone and white neck. Her breathing was slow but could not hide her excitement. Her eyes were half closed, as if she was expecting something that could not be said. I could not stop reaching up, gently stroking her soft hair. Each strand of hair seemed to slip through my fingers, giving me a feeling that was both familiar and strange to Mary. At this moment, I leaned down, my lips brushing her shoulder, feeling the warmth of her skin under the thin layer of her shirt. She slightly shrank back but did not refuse. Instead, her hands began to move to touch my back, pulling me closer. The kiss from my shoulder gradually moved up to my neck. The gentle scent of her skin wafted in the air, awakening all my senses. I paused for a moment, looking into her eyes. For a moment, I clearly saw the fire burning in those eyes, a mixture of desire and reserve. But then she looked up at me, her lips slightly curved as a silent sign of consent. I slowly slid my hand under her shirt, clearly feeling every centimetre of her smooth and warm skin. Her body trembled under each gentle touch. Her breathing became more rapid as my hands moved higher, stopping at her slim waist. She tilted her head slightly forward, her lips finding mine. This kiss was no longer a groping, but a blend of intense emotions, of unstoppable desire. She pulled me down onto the bed, her body heating up little by little as each layer of clothing on her body was removed. Her smooth white skin was like light shining under the lamp. I couldn't take my eyes off her body. Every movement, every breath of hers seemed to be engraved in my memory, making each moment more vivid. As I bent down, my lips lightly brushed against her warm skin. Each touch seemed to evoke irrepressible emotions. She moved slightly, her breathing becoming clearer and more urgent. Her hands wrapped tightly around me, as if wanting to hold on to that closeness longer. The space in the small, narrow room seemed to stop, leaving only the soft sounds of rapid breathing and the sound of clothes rubbing against each other. Sister Mary lay under the yellow light, her eyes closed but her body full of vitality. My hands continued to explore her fertile lands. Each soft line seemed to be engraved in my memory. Her skin was smooth as velvet, warm under each light touch. Her breaths became more and more urgent. Unable to hold back any longer, I moved slowly, my lips tracing her neck down to her delicate collarbone, where her skin was soft and rosy. Each kiss I placed made her tremble slightly. Her slender hands rested on my shoulders. Each finger seemed to want to squeeze tighter, pulling me closer, pressing me against her body. The faint scent from her hair and skin created a pleasant, enchanting feeling that I couldn't stop. At this moment, I gently lifted her hand, clearly feeling each of her long, slender fingers gently caressing my back. She pulled me down, her lips lightly touching my ear, her breathing rapid, her voice broken but full of desire. "Don't stop." Her words were like a fire that flared up, making me unable to control the emotions surging in my heart. My hand moved down along her body, each sexy curve like a piece of music played by touch, soft and delicate. She welcomed my every move with anticipation, her eyes half closed, but expressing intense desire. We were intertwined. The intimate moments seemed to last forever. I could feel the tension in every layer of her skin, her heartbeat growing stronger under my palm. My hands slid lightly over her skin. My lips explored every corner of her body, making her tremble with every touch. I could hear her rapid breathing mingling with my own heartbeat, creating a wordless but emotional melody. She raised her head, her eyes filled with longing, as if to say that we were both deeply immersed in this moment. Nothing could stop us anymore. Her body seemed to respond to every closeness, and as we became one, each minute lasted forever, like an adventure of emotions and perfect harmony. I held her tightly in my arms, feeling the connection between us both physically and mentally. The small room now seemed like a space where only the two of us existed, nothing but mixed emotions and the desire to blend. And then we merged together, enjoying the most sublime feeling of life. We were together for nearly 2 hours before stopping, and both of us hugged each other and fell asleep without realizing it. That night, under the dim moonlight and the quiet space, Mary and I crossed the final boundary. The deep emotions and longings that had been there for so long were released, but along with it came the fear and anxiety of what would come next. Our relationship had completely changed, and I knew there was no turning back. After that night, I could no longer look at Mary the same. Every time I saw her, my heart would pound, and time seemed to stop. During the attack, our image in that moment also changed Mary. She no longer had the natural look she had when she met me. Her eyes were often... Once I caught her standing in the yard in the afternoon, her eyes quietly looking into the distance, as if trying to find some way out in the familiar village scene Marioc. I walked closer but did not say anything. For a moment, I wanted to hug her from behind. I still remember that night, I whispered to myself, but I hoped she could hear it too. Each step I took towards her seemed to weigh more heavily on my heart. She turned around, her eyes meeting mine. No words were spoken, but in that silence I felt understanding and emotions that neither of us could express. She smiled, a sad smile that I had never seen before. She pursed her lips, her eyes filled with a deep sadness that I could never fully understand. "Kevin, I'm sorry for everything," she said softly, her voice breaking. I wanted to reply, to say that I was not willing, that I was also at fault, but the words wouldn't come out of my mouth. All I could do was stand there and watch her walk away, as if there was a distance between us that was growing larger and larger. Her footsteps were light but heavy, as if carrying a pain that any of us could feel. As time passed, the relationship between me and Mary became more and more tense. Every time we met, the feeling of guilt grew heavier. I didn't know how Kevin faced her, and neither did she. My mother didn't seem to notice the change between us. She still did the housework without a care. My sister and I continued to live quietly as before. But then one evening, after dinner, I decided to go out to the yard to sit alone and think. My mind was in turmoil, not knowing how Kevin could escape this feeling of guilt. But then, when my eyes accidentally glanced towards the kitchen door, I saw Mary's figure standing there, silently looking at me. Let's solve this problem. I knew that we couldn't go back to the way we were before. She walked out into the yard, each step gentle but full of determination. I stood up to leave, but my feet seemed to be held back. She approached me, her eyes sparkling in the moonlight. We both knew what was going on, but neither of us had the courage to say it. Finally, Mary spoke first. "I can't live like this, Kevin," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't face James when he comes home." My heart stopped. The name James was a reminder that everything she and I were doing was wrong. But at the same time, I knew that no matter how hard I tried to deny it, we had long since crossed that line. She reached up and placed her hand gently on my shoulder, the warmth of her hand breaking my heart. She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears, but deep down I recognized the look of longing I had seen before. "I know we shouldn't, but I can't stop," she said, her voice catching in her throat. I knew I couldn't stop either, even though my mind was telling me to let Kevin do it. We both knew what we were doing was wrong, but the longing was too strong to stop. My life was never the same again. As the days passed, Mary and I fell deeper into a secret relationship that we both knew could not continue. We met when my mother was not at home, avoiding the curious eyes of the neighbours, but that only increased the feeling of wrongness inside me. Every time I was with her, I felt like I was walking down a path with no way out, but I could not resist her attraction. Then one day I heard that James was coming back. He had finished his long trip and decided to return home after many years of separation. My heart stopped when I heard this news. I didn't know how Kevin would face him. What I had done to Mary couldn't be hidden forever. I was afraid that his eyes would see everything we had hidden. The night after James returned, the atmosphere in the house changed completely. His appearance, although full of joy for my mother, became a burden on Mary and me. James was innocent, not knowing about the relationship between us, but that made me even more afraid. Mary's eyes from the moment he returned carried tension and anxiety, as if she was waiting for something inevitable. Mary and I tried to keep our distance, but the feeling of longing still burned in my heart. Every time we faced each other, the suppressed tension seemed to surge, weighing down the space between us. The more we tried to distance ourselves, the closer we felt, as if we were pulled closer by an irresistible force that held us both together. One night, when the whole family had fallen asleep, James went to the county town to visit his close friend and would probably stay there until the next day. I couldn't sleep. Thoughts of her kept occupying my mind. I decided to go out for a walk to get some fresh air, but my steps unconsciously headed towards her room. The door was only slightly open, and the dim light from the oil lamp inside was shining out. My heart was pounding as I stood outside the door. It felt like my blood was constantly rushing. I didn't know what I was thinking. I just knew that I couldn't resist the desire. I walked gently into her room where she was lying on the bed, her eyes open, looking at me in the darkness. She softly called my name, her voice faltering but not afraid. Without saying a word, I approached her. We both knew what was going to happen, and neither of us could stop it. What had happened between us in the past now became more vivid than ever. I leaned down, feeling her hot breath on my ear, and in that moment, all boundaries between us were erased. She responded to me, her arms tightly wrapped around my back, and we were caught in a whirlwind of inescapable desire. The feeling of kissing her lips, kissing her alluring curves, made all my reason disappear. At this moment, we both understood what was about to happen, like an undercurrent that had long been waiting to explode. Sister Mary, with her deep, emotional eyes, slowly turned to me, her small hand absent-mindedly touching mine. I looked at her, feeling as if time had stopped. All my attention was focused on her every gentle but alluring movement. Her lips were slightly parted, her cheeks were flushed, and at that moment I couldn't help but touch her. My hand slowly moved forward, gently placed on her soft cheek, feeling the warmth from her skin transmitted through each finger. She didn't avoid it. Her eyes met mine, containing so much desire that no words could describe. I leaned down and placed my lips on hers. The first feeling was the softness and sweetness of those lips. At first it was just a light kiss, but soon after, The overwhelming emotions made it impossible for both of us to stop. Sister Mary responded. Her lips touched mine more passionately. The kiss became deeper, full of desire. I hugged her, pulling her closer so that our bodies blended together. All the previous reservations seemed to disappear, leaving only the feeling of being lost in the passion that neither of us could stop. My hand gently slid along her slender back, feeling every beautiful curve hidden under the thin fabric of her shirt. Sister Mary trembled slightly, but her hand still wrapped tightly around me, pulling me closer. Her breathing became more and more rapid. A soft but longing breath echoed in the quiet room. I gently lifted her hand, pulled her shirt off slowly, as if wanting to enjoy every moment of this. Her shirt slowly slid down, revealing her smooth white skin, cool under the light. I couldn't stop myself from leaning down to place my lips on her neck, feeling the warmth from her skin through each kiss. She trembled slightly but didn't resist. On the contrary, she responded to me with more intensity. Each touch of mine on her skin felt like an underground electric current, making Mary unable to suppress her trembling. Her hands slid along my back, feeling her soft hands pulling me closer. I could clearly feel her heartbeat speeding up, her breathing becoming heavy, blending with my rapid breathing. Every movement I made was now slow and careful. Each movement seemed to be prolonged to enjoy the feeling of being close to Mary. I leaned down to place my lips on her shoulder, each gentle kiss gliding across her soft skin, and I felt her breathing gradually becoming chaotic. She leaned back, her arms still wrapped tightly around me, her eyes half closed, captivating. That feeling of closeness seemed to make time stop, and the world was left with only the two of us, immersed in an intense, uncontrollable emotion. I continued to explore the sweet feelings. Each sexy curve was drawn under the dim light. Sister Mary was completely relaxed now. Her hand was still on my back. Her breath seemed to be getting more and more urgent. We were immersed in a feeling of sublimation, no longer aware of time or anything else. That closeness, that contact made everything become blurred. Only the feeling of two bodies blending together remained. Sister Mary's breathing became more and more hurried. Her hands wrapped around my neck, pulling me closer, leaving no distance between us. This feeling, that intense connection, made me unable to stop. Sister Mary whispered my name under her breath, her voice trembling but full of desire, like an unquenchable fire burning in the space of the fairy world. I suddenly heard a strange noise from the door. I turned around and was startled to stand right in front of the door. In the dim light was James. He had returned that night. His eyes looking at us were not P. Kevin's fleeting look, but a bloodshot, uncontrollable look inside. Everything in the room became coldly silent, and James's gaze seemed to burn. "What the hell is this?" James's voice rang out angrily like an approaching storm. I didn't know what P. Kevin said, didn't know how to defend my actions. I stammered, but couldn't say any answer. The whole world seemed to collapse under my feet when his hateful eyes looked straight at me. I saw the betrayal in those eyes, and I knew I had lost everything. James stepped forward, his face red with anger. I didn't react when he rushed at me, giving me a heavy blow. I fell to the ground in pain but unable to fight back. I knew I deserved it, and I had no excuse for what I did. Mary stood there, tears streaming down her face, but she couldn't say anything. She was caught up in James's pain and anger. In the next moment, our world had come crashing down. "Who do I think you are?" James roared, his voice cracking with rage. "I trusted you. I trusted my uncle. And you two did this behind my back." He stepped back as if he couldn't accept the truth before him. The storm inside him rose, and I knew that things would never be the same again. After beating me up, James turned and left the room, leaving Mary and me in the pain that remained. She sat on the floor, her eyes filled with tears as she watched James. I tried to stand up, but I knew that things were beyond saving. Mary, the one I longed for, the one I loved and the one I hurt so deeply, was now nothing more than a shadow. She couldn't face James, and I didn't have the courage to face myself. Our relationship had been exposed, and now we had to make Kevin pay for what we had done. The next day, James left the house without a word. My mother had no idea what had happened, only that the family had been torn apart. Mary and I were now trapped in our own wrongdoing, unable to escape. Every time I saw her, I was reminded of the sweet and longing, but also painful moments. We could never go back to the way things were, and I didn't know how I could continue living with this burden. My relationship with Mary was now just a big wound, an indelible mark on my life. We both knew that we had crossed a line that should not have been crossed, and now Kevin had to face the consequences. After that fateful night, the whole house was filled with an eerie silence. James had left without saying a word. No one knew where he went, and my mother Zara didn't ask much. She just felt the tension that enveloped the house. But Kevin endured. She didn't want to dig deeper into that pain. Everything was like a time bomb, waiting for the last moment. Mary changed completely. She was calmer. Her eyes often looked into the distance, as if searching for something that no longer existed. She avoided meeting me, avoiding my eyes whenever possible. I knew she was living an unbearable life, but so was I. I carried a heavy feeling of guilt, but at the same time, I still couldn't shake the sweet longing I had for her. Every night, when I returned to bed after a long day in the fields, I lay awake. The image of James, the anger in his eyes, and the blow to my face left an indelible mark. I was no longer the innocent boy I once was. My life, from the moment Mary and I crossed that line, had changed completely. One evening after my mother had gone to bed, I decided to go out into the yard to get some fresh air. The moon was high again, its pale yellow light spreading across the fields. My footsteps unconsciously led me to Mary's room. The door was ajar as before, and I could see a faint light from inside. My heart was pounding. Something urged me to go in, even though I knew I shouldn't. When I stepped in, Mary was sitting on the bed, her eyes looking out the window. She didn't notice my presence until I sat down next to her. I could feel her breathing, soft but heavy, filled with pent-up emotions. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice broken in the darkness. She didn't know how things had turned out like this, and she didn't know how to escape it. I was silent, unable to say a word. Her apology cut deep into my heart, but I knew that no matter how many apologies we made, we could not fix what had happened. What we had done to each other could not be erased, and we both knew it. In the days that followed, Mary and I continued to live under the same roof, but the distance between us grew. My mother had not yet noticed anything unusual, but Mary had become more and more quiet, as if waiting for something to end. Sometimes I would catch her sitting in front of the house, her eyes looking far away towards the fields where James had spent cool afternoons with her. One afternoon while I was working in the fields, a strange man approached me. He introduced himself as a friend of James's from the city and said that James wanted to send a message. My heart stopped when I heard James's name. The man handed me a letter, his strong handwriting clearly visible on the paper. "Kevin, I can't go back to that house. What I saw between you and my sister-in-law is unforgivable. You betrayed my trust, and I don't trust anything anymore. Not only did you betray me, you hurt the woman I loved and trusted the most in the world. I'm gone, and I'll probably never come back. Live with the consequences of what you did. You both have to bear this pain, Kevin." "James!" After reading the letter, my heart froze. James's words were the final judgment, like a sharp knife stabbing deep into my heart. He was gone, and I had no chance to explain. I knew from that moment everything was over. There was no hope, no way back. After receiving the letter, I returned home in a daze, not knowing how Kevin would face Mary. We both had reached our limits, and I knew that if we didn't make a decisive decision, everything would continue to sink into pain. I went into Mary's room, holding James's letter and placing it in front of her. She took it, her hands trembling as she read each line, tears rolling down her cheeks, and I knew that she also felt the pain I was going through. "I'm leaving," she said softly, her voice shaking with tears. "I can't stay here, Kevin. I've hurt James, I've hurt you, I've hurt myself. I have no choice." I said nothing, just nodded silently. Even though I didn't want her to leave, I knew it was the best thing for both of us. Our relationship had become an unhealed wound, and if she stayed, the pain would never end. The day Mary left, it was pouring rain. She didn't tell my mother the real reason. She said she needed time to think, to find herself. I stood silently in front of the house, watching her walk away in the rain, her shoulders shaking under the cold water. She didn't turn around, and I didn't call out to her. I knew that if I tried to hold on, I would only make things worse. Her figure disappeared down the village road, and I knew that was the last time I would see her. She left, taking with her my painful memories and guilt. After Mary left, I felt like the house was emptier than ever. My mother continued her daily life, not knowing what had happened, but she also realized the heavy silence that covered everything. I tried to live on, but the pain and sense of loss never went away. I knew I had made a mistake and there was no way to go back. The following months were the time when I, Kevin, faced myself with the sins I had caused. Every afternoon when I was in the field looking into the distance, I remembered the days we were together, remembered the sweet but sinful moments. My life was never the same again. What happened between me and Mary changed me forever. I lost my brother, my sister-in-law whom I loved, and lost my peace within myself. Her apology cut deep into my heart, but I knew no matter how many apologies we made, we could never undo what had happened. What we had done to each other could never be undone, and we both knew it. Our story today will stop here. If you find this story interesting, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment about your thoughts below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next interesting stories. Each like, a share button, and a subscription from you will be the motivation for Jane and the program production team to create more interesting videos. And now I would like to say goodbye and see you again in the next videos. Wish you all a wonderful day.